Hello and welcome back to our fourth and final week of our Let It Shine quilt along. If you are now just joining us, please make sure to go back and watch videos from week 1, 2, and 3. In those videos, we prepped our fabric, we cut our fabric, we sewed the small inner units, and then we sewed those blocks into our larger blocks. And now it's time for our quilt top assembly, in which we will finally be done with sewing our quilt top. Before we start sewing our rows, we will need to figure out block placement. In order to do this, I usually clear a large space on my floor to lay out my blocks since I don't have a design wall. I try not to place any matching fabrics or similar colors next to each other unless I'm trying to do, let's say, like a gradient quilt where I want dark colors and moving them down to the lighter colors. Here's a tip that I've tried a few times to help me with that. I lay out my blocks on the floor and then I take a black and white photo of my quilt blocks. This will help me see the gradients better, and I can tell if I have too many darks together or too many lights together. I like to evenly spread out my dark, medium, and light fabrics. Also, if you're working with prints, you might want to keep in mind your large scale prints and your small scale prints, and maybe make sure that those are also evenly spread out in your quilt top. This is a good time to swap out your blocks and to move them around and to fine tune your quilt top layout. But try not to get bogged down by it too much or overthink the placement, because it can lead to decision paralysis, I know, and then you just can't stop moving them around. So find a good layout that you like, and then take a photo of the quilt top of the way that you have your blocks laid out. I like to do this in case I get my blocks out of order, or maybe my kids read in the room and they mess my blocks up. I know I can go back and look at the photo to see how I had the blocks laid out. In this quilt, you may also be sewing some long seams, especially if you're making the throw twin or queen size quilt. So here are some helpful tips when sewing long seams. First, make sure your sewing area is prepped. I like to make sure that my sewing table is clear of anything, as the quilt top is going to be laying on it. I can't tell you how many times I have spilled a container of pins or knocked my sewing toolbox off the table and left with a huge mess, and even have broken the lid on the box. So make sure your space is clear for your quilt top, especially on that left side of your machine. I even move my machine over a little bit to the right so I have more room for my quilt top to lay on the left side of my table. You might also want to move your table a few inches away from the wall, or if you can even place another table behind your sewing space so that as you're sewing those long rows, they can rest on that other table and not weigh down as you're trying to sew those long seams. When I get my fabric ready to sew, I also use pins to help match up my seams. If possible, I try to nest my seams together. That's why I like to press one seam going maybe to the left and the other row of seams going to the right, so then those seams can lock into each other and nest really neatly together. And that's right where I place the pin, and that helps match my seams up perfectly. You are going to construct your quilt in rows. With my quilt blocks laid out, I flip over the first block onto the second block for each row. I then chain piece and sew those first two blocks together, and then I press them with my seams to one side, alternating for each row. I then sew the next block onto the row. For my throw-sized quilt, my rows have 3 blocks, and there are 3 rows total for that quilt. If you are sewing the queen-sized quilt, you may want to sew your blocks together in quadrants, and then sew those quadrants together for your quilt top. That will allow you to sew smaller, more manageable sections before piecing them together into such a large quilt top. You can also assemble your rows one at a time. That will also help you keep your blocks more organized. You can also wait to press your blocks until you have a full row sewn together instead of pressing after each block sewn together. As I said earlier, make sure that you press your seams to one side. Alternate for each row, so then when you sew those long rows together, you can nest the seams as you sew. When you have your rows constructed, you will then sew each row together. This is where those tips from earlier in regards to sewing long seams come into play. I will take the first two rows and I will lay the top row down onto the second row, right sides together. And I will first nest my seams in place with a pin to hold it in place, and then I will add other pins going out from that seam until I get to the next nested seam. Take your time and make sure that you are getting your seams aligned. Then sew your rows together. Once you have your rows sewn together, press your seams. If you want, at this point, you can press your seams open or still to the side. Once you have all of your rows sewn to each other, you will have your quilt top constructed. Now, this step is optional, but you can also add a stay stitch all around the edge of your quilt. My long armor prefers that I do this, so I like to add an 1/8 of an inch stitch all around the edges. This helps your seams to not pull apart as you fold your quilt top or as the long armor is loading it onto their frame. You can also back stitch for each of your long seams at the beginning and end to help make sure those seams stay in place. Then you will have your finished Let It Shine quilt top. I am so excited for you and I can't wait to see all of your versions. Please make sure to share a photo with me on Instagram or send me an email with a photo. I can't wait to see everyone's beautiful quilt top. Now for this week's prize. To enter, share a progress photo on Instagram and make sure to tag me at fieldstone.fabric and use the hashtags #LetItShineQuilts and #LetItShineQAL. I will announce the winner in my email next week since we won't have a video. The sponsor for this week's prize is so generous, and it's Novadon. The sheep is giving one of their large 5 feet long wool mats. This is such an awesome prize, so make sure that you enter. Well, that's it for the Let It Shine quilt along. It has been such a pleasure to make this quilt along with you. Take care, and I hope to see you soon.